Thank you so much, John. What a pleasure to be here. Thanks for involving us from all the way in the middle of nowhere. We are living at the dawn of an industry. When you think about it, this is an amazing time, not just to be alive, but to be watching cybersecurity. We've literally been sending people to the moon for longer than we've had the internet. And cybersecurity testing is just a breath of time compared with everything else. So keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. What we're experiencing right now as we hammer out the rules of the road, as we hammer out expectations throughout our community, we're coming to decisions that 40 years from now, people will take for granted. Things that you see, debates that you think are really up in the air, or even small decisions that are made now are going to have ripple effects for decades to come. So I think that the conversation we're having today is extremely important. The fact that we're bringing our community together to talk about what happened. And thank you so much to John and to everyone at Black Hills for taking some time out to have this conversation. With any new technology, whether it's the internet or automobiles, we need to keep people safe. And safety guidelines evolve over time. And that is as true in our industry as it is in others. So just for comparison, I want to show you some of the early safety guidelines in automobiles. Here you can see a baby going for a ride in the car in his homemade armchair. It looks like his dad made him a baby seat so he could see out the window, not to restrain him if the car stops suddenly, but so that they could see. And that's what baby harnesses were for at that time. In fact, I think if you look closely, that's a desk chair that is like somehow glued to the seat. You can see on the right what was called a man catcher. So it was, people didn't like the fact that cars were running people over and killing them. So instead they created this scooping device. So if you hit a pedestrian, you would just gently scoop them up, so the theory goes, and just sort of knock them out of the way. So we don't really see these man catchers today, but of course what we do have are seat belts. And at the time, no one had even thought of seat belts, and today we take them for granted. So again, keep that in mind as we're going through this conversation today. What do you think should be the standard? Because the decisions that we come to as a community will stick around. Penetration testing in particular is an inherently risky activity and a very important activity as well. Obviously, you want to find your vulnerabilities before the hackers do. But as we're engaged in this, it's best to step back and think about, do we need to wear helmets or the equivalent? How do we work together? How do we inspect our tools and make sure that they're working correctly? Things like that. And I don't know if you can see the little words on my slide there, but safety is a partnership. It's not just penetration testers alone that can help establish the rules of the road, but clients also need to establish it. Law enforcement needs to work together. Everybody in the community needs to come to a consensus on what are our standard methods for ensuring that we're reducing our risk. And I'm curious to see from those of you who are in the room, how many of you are penetration testers versus how many of you hire penetration testers or might be otherwise involved. So if you're a penetration tester, please raise your hand. If you're at home, you can totally raise your hand too. People might look at you weird, but that's fine. I can see you. Great. If you hire penetration testers, raise your hand. Okay, I can see all of you, including those at home as well. Thank you. That's helpful to understand. All of us have to work together. So here are some of the meta security questions that we need to answer as a community. Number one, how do we authenticate and check the authorization of things like targets? When we're coming on site, how do we know what buildings we're supposed to get into? How do we know if this computer that we're hacking into really is the right computer? We don't want to hack into the wrong computer. That can have some pretty big consequences. And then clients, as penetration testers, when I'm working with a client, how do I know that the person signing the contract has authority to do that? How do I know they actually own this building? How do I know if sometimes we see internal conflicts, and that's something that our CTO, Dan Featherman, is going to talk about later in this presentation. But if we have two people within our client's organization that are at odds, who do you listen to? Who's actually authorized? And then when it comes to third-party vendors, whether they're cloud providers or manufacturers that have provided devices on site, how do you know that you're authorized to test their systems? Sometimes this is something that the client actually has to take care of. Finally, law enforcement. Law enforcement needs to, we need, as penetration testers, need to authenticate law enforcement. I don't know about you guys, but after almost 20 years in the industry, I do not trust just any random stranger that walks up to me in a cop uniform, because you can buy those. And also, law enforcement needs to know how to authenticate testers, which is a tricky question when none of us have inside information. None of us are part of the internal organization that is being tested. So all of this applies whether we're breaking into places, whether we're asked to stop work, who can tell us to stop work? If we collect evidence, what kind of evidence are we allowed to collect? Can we actually take that computer and stick it in the trunk of our car, or will that make somebody angry? If it makes somebody angry, is it still something the authorized contact wants us to do? That has come up. Sometimes they want you to make somebody else angry, which is a whole different ball of wax. If you report findings, who do you report those to? Who can you share details with? The FBI? Is that something the client wants or doesn't want? So all these things apply. And the good news is in security, we're very good at authentication and authorization in general, or at least we understand the concepts. So we just need to talk about how we apply them to our own testing processes. And by the way, if anyone has a question, feel free to shout it out. I think John gave me a great intro, so you don't need to know much about my background. Other than that, I have a new book out as of a couple weeks ago, Data Breaches. And more importantly, when I started out over 20 years ago, I did physical hacking. And I learned so much from those early days when I was at MIT, crawling through elevator shafts and finding interstitial spaces. This is a photograph of a big mural that we have in the tomb of the underground tool. So it's a basement, a sub-basement space that you have to work hard to get to. It's the hacking ethics. And over time, the hacker community started printing these off on little laminated cards that were really useful for carding doors as well. So of course we carried them around in the pockets of our BDU, but they also served as this really important reminder of what are the rules of the road for our community. So even though it's a loose-knit community, there's really nobody in charge, everybody's on the same page. Things like never drink and hack, never hack alone. These were all standards that we had come up with over time. And sometimes, you know, you have to have a lot of bad ideas to come up with a good idea in a lot of cases, and our community had learned over time, in some cases the hard way, that these were important things, just like we're learning right now. So at LMG, I founded LMG 10 years ago, and as the company grew and as our industry evolved, it became clear that we too needed some rules of the road. And so we developed here the Pen Testers Code of Conduct. This is a giant poster that is right in the center of our workspace here in Montana at LMG. And you can see it goes through everything like know your scope and do not exceed your scope, all the way to communicate with your teammates. And above all, exercise common sense, something that is hard to teach. But that's down there at the bottom, and that is actually verbatim from the hacking ethics. So it's applied for a long time. For those of you who are live and in the room, I have some swag for you. I took the Pen Testers Code of Conduct and printed it out on a laminated card, just like we used to have. So my friend Tom Pohl will be passing that out right now. Thank you so much, Tom. You can use these to card a door, and it also reminds you of the rules of the road before you decide to card that door, things that you need to do. So I hope this is fun and useful for you. For those of you that are remote, I have a link. We have this up on our blog today so that you guys can check it out as well. By the way, I recommend for those of you in person, you might want to take a little pair of scissors and round the corner. I wasn't there in person, so I didn't have a chance to do that, but it just makes it easier to slide the door that way. All right, so the number one item in the Pen Testers Code of Conduct is know your scope. So important. I would say 99% of the issues that I've seen in pen tests really boil down to misunderstandings or disagreements about what was or was not in scope, whether it's after hours testing or daytime testing, or this building was in scope, that building wasn't in scope, or I thought I could take that information, I thought I could take that piece of equipment and I couldn't. Sometimes it's just things that are left out of the statement of work. Sometimes it's that either the client or the pen tester didn't carefully read that statement of work. And so it's always a good idea to go through that together to make sure you really understand it. And don't just wave off that paperwork, because that is good contracts make good understanding. My friend and attorney Shane Bonata used to say, that is the rules of the road for your engagement. So make sure everybody, clients, pen testers, take a few minutes, know your scope. If you have any questions or concerns, bring it up before the test. It's a mutual responsibility. I want to tell you some war stories. So I'll start with a few, and then I'm really pleased to be here with our team today. So I'm going to bring a few of the experienced folks from our team in to share some of their stories as well. So when we're conducting external penetration tests, quite often we are given the wrong IP addresses, more often than you might think. And this has always been a problem. Often clients will transpose digits in the IP address, and of course one transposed digit can make a really huge difference. Sometimes there's been an address reallocation, so maybe the address assignments are from a really long time ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and they've never updated their records, and so some of those have been assigned to someone else. We see that, for example, when mergers and acquisitions have been taking place quite a bit. So we always look to verify. Yep.
Yeah, we have some people here that are relatively new to the idea of pen testing and what we're doing. What is an IP address before you move on?
Oh, thank you. So an IP address is a lot like the address of a house. It's how do you find your computer on the internet? And it typically looks like a string of digits like 10.1.1.42. And that just tells my computer where I should be sending packets over the internet. Thanks for asking that. So we are often given the wrong addresses, and just like a wrong physical address, we don't want to break into the wrong computer, because that can have not only ethical repercussions, but also legal repercussions. If someone broke into your computer and stole a bunch of stuff, you would probably have the right to sue, or at least you might get very upset. There might be some reputational damage, things like that. I am not a lawyer. I'll leave that stuff to Ben. But the bottom line is to protect everybody, the client, the pen tester, and any third parties. We need to make sure that that's correct. So I was shocked when I started off years and years ago, and I would ask for verification, and I would get a ton of pushback from clients. I'd say, hey, so I start by doing a Whois lookup, which means you're looking it up in a public database to see who owns it. And a lot of times it just says the internet service provider. Like here in Montana, we might have Blackfoot Telecommunications. That doesn't do me a whole lot of good. So then I might go to the client and say, hey, can I see the documentation from your internet service provider? Can I get just a quick email from them just confirming that these are the right IP addresses? And they would say things like, I've never had to do that before. I don't want to do that. Maybe I'll just go with another company. I did a lot of subcontracting in the early days as well. And this got me into hot water with one of the large companies I was subcontracting from, because they were like, hey man, whatever the client says goes. And I was like, well, it's our, we have to make sure that we're breaking into the right place. And I started to see errors enough times that it was clear that this was a really important process. I'll show you one of the errors that we had. Okay, so here I was conducting a penetration test of a credit union. We'll call them a Texas credit union. And I did a Whois lookup, looked them up in that public database, and I got something similar to what you're seeing here. So here it says Frontier Communications. Actually, I think they're out of New York. But this is just an example of what you might get from Whois. So you don't see the organization's name in that. And so I said to the client, hey, I just need some kind of verification. Do you have the documentation where you were assigned this, or can I just get a quick email from the ISP? And they really pushed back a lot, more than almost any other client I'd ever had. But eventually I said, I can't start the test without it. And they eventually talked to the ISP. The ISP confirmed in writing, which turned out to be extremely important. So our pen tester starts work, and usually when they get root on a system, they sent me a little text message that said root dance. And so not too long after he started, I got the root dance message, and I was like, awesome, nice work. And then I got a phone call. And this was unusual. So he called me and he said, I don't think this is their box. And I was like, what do you mean you don't think it's their box? We got verification on it. And he said, this is, the data on this box is from a retailer. It really doesn't seem like the right system. I don't know what to do. And I said, okay, halt work. And so we notified the client. We notified the internet service provider, and the internet service provider did some digging, and it turned out they were wrong. They had actually allocated some of that space to a totally different customer of theirs, which was in fact a retailer. So here we are. We've now broken into some totally random person's box and accessed a bunch of their data. That's a problem. The good news for us and for our client is that it was the internet service provider that had to tell their customer that they had made a mistake. So if we hadn't done that, our client would have just given us the wrong address, and it would have been on them. It would have been on our client, and our client would have been responsible for giving us the wrong system to attack. But instead, the verification process actually protected our client as well, because we had the internet service provider verify that. And if anyone has any further questions along the way, again, feel free to shout it out. So when you verify, this is something that we really need as an industry to come to a consensus on. Some pen testers do no verification, some testers do a ton of verification. What is appropriate? You can do a Whois lookup. And a lot of times, especially these days, you'll get Amazon, you'll get the cloud provider, or you'll get the internet service provider. So then there's a couple other approaches you can take. You can try to get confirmation from the registered owner, which we used to do a lot back in the day. So get a message from the internet service provider. And that used to be fairly straightforward. But what if you get a larger organization that has systems in dozens of different countries, or at sometimes hundreds of different ISPs? It's just too much work to do. You can try to get screenshots of their configuration systems. I guarantee you, when you get a list of IP addresses that is that long, there will be errors in it, and you don't want to be pen testing the wrong systems. Here's an example, by the way. This is a screenshot of a verification email from an internet service provider. And yes, it's true. These are not like cryptographically signed messages. It is possible to fake an email. It is possible for clients to fake screenshots of their configuration. But at that point, you're dealing with actual fraud, and you have way bigger problems. Here's another one, a physical assessment that I did much longer ago. This was actually before I started my own company. So I was a consultant working for a different company, and we were doing testing for a large bank. And we've done a number of sites for them. And one of the sites that we needed to get into was a backup/disaster recovery center. So they gave us the address, and we went to the facility, and it looked super sketchy. Like, you know, we circled the building. We were like, this is so sketch. It made sense that it was totally abandoned because, you know, it's their backup DR center. But, you know, there's no sign of the bank. And, you know, that might also make sense. They probably don't want to advertise that it's their facility. But we look through the windows, and it's just piles of newspapers, and it seems really empty. And so we called our client, and we said, hey, this looks like it's the wrong address. And our client said, let me check. And he came back on and he said, nope, that's the right address. Go for it. And we were like, okay. And we stood there. It started to rain. This is actually covered in the book Breaking and Entering by Jeremy Smith, this one scene. So we're there. It starts to rain. We kind of half-heartedly started to pick the lock, but both of us agreed, like, we had the willies and something wasn't right. So we decided to get back in the car and just do some further checking and reconnaissance before we really went at it. And we're in the car about 15 minutes later, and we get a call from the client that said, hey, stop, I just discovered we made a mistake. It is the wrong address. So right there, we were about to physically break into the wrong facility, which is pretty scary when you think about it. Again, I don't want to be involved in this situation like many pen testers have been, where a client gives you the wrong address and you end up someplace you actually should not be. So how do we conduct physical verification? This is something that I've thought a lot about over the years. It's not always straightforward. When you can easily do a lookup in public property records. So here I'm looking up the address of the Adel Public Library, 301 South 10th Street. And you can see that the owner is the city of Adel. So boom, right there, I know who the owner is, and I can go from there to figure out who the authorized contact should be. And there's also this handy DBA in the site as well that says Adel City Hall and Library. But the problem is a lot of spaces, of course, are leased, and leases can change over time. There may not be a public record of it. Do we really want to go to the point of contacting landlords? It doesn't seem like clients want to go to that level of verification. So what can you do? Well, you can, of course, look at the organization's website. That's always a really good sanity check. See what address is listed on there. Could be a past address, but usually that's pretty good. You can do Google Earth, checking it out on Google Earth, verifying that it seems sane. If you have any other suggestions, again, I'm hoping that this is a dialogue. John, others, I don't know if there are other ways that you verify it, but I'd love to hear from you, and feel free to shout it out if you think of things.
So anyone in the room? I know we have a lot of firms. I'm coming up at the front, Sherri.
What's that?
Oh, someone just said, pretend you're delivering pizza. That's a good way to get inside and look around a little bit, but you should bring pizza. Otherwise, people get mad.
Should bring pizza or donuts works amazingly well.
One of the things, Sherri, that we've been doing is very similar to what you have here is we have a TransUnion account that does background investigation. So anytime you work for a company, you can do a full background investigation. They also have the ability to check property. And as part of that database, it'll say this particular property has these tenants at that location. So we've used that as well to verify on the BHIS side. Any other points?
Great idea.
All right, Sherri, back to you.
Okay, yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks for adding that. And also that's where reconnaissance comes in. So just scoping out a facility for hours or days beforehand, making sure that the people who go in are who you expect, visiting it maybe with your client contact, that always works great. Okay, so things to consider in physical pen testing, obviously leased spaces, but this is a particular issue with shared spaces. So many times clients want you to test their facilities, and their facilities are just one floor in a bigger building, like you see on the upper right in this slide. So in that case, what's in scope? Can you break in, what's in scope in those common areas especially? What's in scope in the elevator, in the roof, in the basement? It is not always clear. So if you hire penetration testers and you're thinking of having a physical test done, please consider adding permission to test to your lease so it's really clear. This is, again, something that clients have control over, but is a bit outside the scope of what pen testers can do. You also have to think about visitors and how the pen testers will interact with those visitors. Here's a picture of a hotel where you have a ton of guests. What's in scope? What's out of scope? We also think a lot about when we do USB drops, for example. So for those of you who are new, we might drop USBs in a parking lot. When someone plugs those in, it sends a beacon, excuse me. It phones home out to us. What if an employee picks that up and takes it home and plugs it into their home systems? Now that's kind of outside of scope. So you might think about in your employment agreements or your employee training, just making a point of saying, we do these physical pen tests, don't pick up USBs, this type of thing could happen. Again, I would have legal just keep that in mind as you're drafting those employment agreements. All right, moving along. Sorry, my clicker is not working as well. I want to pause here. Yeah, I want to pause here for a moment and invite my team to come in. We have, thanks guys. This is Dan Featherman, who's our CTO and a longtime, very experienced penetration tester. We have Delaney Moore, who is an accomplished social engineer and a compliance expert. And we have Matt Duran, who is adjusting our camera. Thank you, Matt. Matt is an experienced incident responder. Come on in, Andy, if you want to do that so Matt can sit down. And that's good. Thank you. Okay, so Dan, I know you've had quite a few experiences that you could share today. Do you want to tell us about this hospital network you were testing?
Sure, yeah. So definitely a major healthcare provider, and we were contracted by Infosec, not by IT specifically. And so I went in with the goal of testing just a very small subset of their network. Infosec was looking to have exploitation done wherever possible. And so we threw shells at some Windows XP boxes or threw exploits at some Windows XP boxes and got shells back.
And this is documented in the statement of work and everything else. So we know we've got it all written down, what we're allowed to do and what we're not.
Yep. Our point of contact gave very clear rules of engagement for what we were allowed to exploit and what we weren't. And the systems that I exploited were in scope. We had authorization to test those. As soon as I got a shell on a box, I reported that back to our point of contact, as well as several other folks that were CC'd on the email, and immediately got an email back from one of them saying, whoa, 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 what are you doing? Stop. You shouldn't be exploiting that box.
So I want to hold up for a second. So we use a lot of slang in this industry. Just so you all know, whenever we say shell on a box, it doesn't mean like we're getting clam shells or oyster shells. Anytime we refer to shell, that refers to access to that computer system. And that's usually, if you've ever seen a command prompt on a computer, we call that a shell. So if we refer to something as getting shells, that means that we've gotten access to those computer systems, usually through an exploit. Sorry, continue.
No, yeah, thank you for clarifying.
So what was that box?
Turns out it was a nuclear camera running Windows XP. And this was just a year and a half ago, so a very outdated operating system at that point.
Yeah, no kidding. So here you are hacking into clinical systems that might even be connected to patients in some cases, and clinical engineering. You're at a client and two different people are telling you two different things.
Exactly.
So if somebody tells you to halt work, how do you know that's legit? How do you know that you should? And who do you listen to?
And that's a great question. As I'm contracted by, the point of contact, whoever signed off on that statement of work, that's the person I'm listening to. And this is the person driving me to exploit anything and everything I can in the environment. Yeah. So it does become a bit of a balancing act, and it gets to be a little bit political.
Hopefully not, but hold on one second. There we go. Did that move forward for you guys?
Yep.
It did?
We just saw a document.
Oh, there we go. You see March Madness?
Yep, we do.
Great.
Perfect. Yeah, so this was another good example of, I think, where we may potentially have a misunderstanding of where authorization, how far that extends. So we were contracted to do an external penetration test of a very large school, educational facility. And as part of this external penetration test, we do our standard reconnaissance and enumeration. So I'm looking at every web server that's internet exposed from this organization, and I have a little script that runs through and takes screenshots of each one as we go. Going back and looking through those screenshots, one of them had a very interesting all black background. Was not, or rather there was a default IIS landing page, a web server landing page. And so we ran some tools to try to find what is actually lying behind or hosted on that web server. What we ended up finding was a building automation system. So lighting, HVAC, I mean, you name it. There were some UPSs or power supplies. So there was an electrical component to it as well. I ended up mucking with this for a little while because it was the juiciest thing we were seeing from an external perspective. Their security posture was pretty good otherwise.
And they were having a big sports event at that time, is that right?
They were.
Dan didn't know what it was at first.
Yeah, no, so I do have some sysadmin and facilities management background too. So as soon as I saw it, I had a good understanding of what we were looking at. And so I kept mucking with it a little bit and ended up finding a bypass vulnerability to get around the authentication mechanism. And as soon as I did that, I had control over their entire HVAC system, all of their lighting, all of their scheduling, power to certain facilities. One of those facilities happened to be the gymnasium that was hosting a March Madness basketball game at that moment in time. So we could have turned the lights off at halftime or done all sorts of fun things.
Well, I know the vendor was not. So it turned out that this was a leased system. Is that right? So that's where a lot of the issues came into play. So this was actually not a system that was owned by the client, even though it was on their address space. It was leased, and the vendor was really upset.
The vendor was furious. The client was really happy. They were glad that we found this vulnerability before some malicious actor did. The HVAC vendor was not at all happy. I don't know that they were aware that penetration testing was going to be done on their systems. And so we ended up having a call after the engagement was over, and the HVAC vendor was screaming into the phone, and my point of contact was defending me. Didn't disclose our name or who we worked for or anything like that. So they know
sensed, now.
Exactly. They sensed how sensitive this was.
Yeah, but I mean, even though something's on your address space, that box contained intellectual property for the vendor. It had usernames and passwords that belonged to the vendor. And so there's this real gray area about whether or not you even have authorization to test that box. And forgive me, my clicker's not working. So in these gray areas, what can we do? I want to jump down to the client's bullet because really, again, this is an area where we need to work together. And hopefully over the next decade, those of us who are hiring penetration testers can really push this issue in vendor management and contracting inside of our contracts. So if you have vendor equipment on your network, you need to either think about segregating that or actually getting permission from vendors to test their equipment so things like this don't happen. And I'm sure it happens to many pen testers all across the board. So it'd be nice to nip this one in the bud. Another thing you can do is just track your asset IP addresses. A lot of people don't really track what's your equipment, what's leased equipment, and it's all just kind of mishmashed together until we scan it. For pen testers, we can try to pay attention to the host names, right? Yep. And try to really get a sense, if they're just descriptive, get a sense of what it is that we're looking at. Of course, we're always guessing. And proactively mention this to clients. Hey, do you have any third party on your equipment on your network? Is this something that's in scope? Will the vendor be upset? Maybe we should give them a heads up.
Yeah, SSL certificates.
We have a question in the room. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And as much for Ben also, because if someone's going to put something on my network, if I have a document in place that says, you're putting this on my network needs to be secure, I have the right to have pen test done on it, does that cover me? Because what it sounds like is you're saying, I understand on your side, you want to go about this as legally as possible, but there's not a hacker in the world out there who's doing this legally. And it's going to be like, oh my gosh, that HVAC system, they may have IPR on there.
Yeah.
I can't go there. Bullcrap. They're going to get into your system.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have a pen test done, you need to be including those boxes. And it's going to be a while before everybody's on the same page about this. So really today, I just want to raise this issue so that everybody can be aware. We need to start including this stuff in contracts when vendors first come on your network. Again, it's going to be a gray area for a long time to come, and you do need to still include those in pen testing, or you're going to have hackers exploiting them.
Absolutely.
But to Ben's case, does something blanket like that at least kind of cover my butt?
So I want to repeat the question. So basically you're saying a vendor comes on site, they put a device on your network, you paid that vendor to show up. Now you're having a tester come in and test that device and the vendors get angry. So the question is, if I'm paraphrasing it and reflecting it back correctly, the question is, if it's on my network and I have authorization to test it, does that cover me legally, or do vendors have authorization to say our stuff cannot be tested? And Ben, if you want to come up here and answer it, that would
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. And thanks for repeating the question, John, because you can hear it better than we can.
Well, there's so many different precise scenarios. Obviously, having a written contract where someone agrees that because they're in your environment, that they could be tested. The written contract is very helpful. And obviously you want to be as clear as possible. A challenge is that these contracts can be voluminous. People don't pay attention to them. Whoever signs off on the contract is more of a technical person rather than higher management. They may not have legal review. And so they may not have really gone in there and read down to page number 17 and clause number 14 and really deeply understood what that meant. And therefore, an important lesson about getting authority to do things is to think beyond just the words of a contract and think very practically. Do people understand what's going on? Or do I need to highlight this? Do I need to have a special telephone call, or special email, or something like that? But the more that you can think about this like humans and think about who's going to be angry and try to resolve that, then the less likely you're going to have misunderstanding. You have a comment from me?
Well, I just comment about both. So in my experience, that's been an issue when you assume that, what does secure mean? So you have an assumption based on your policies and procedures. An external vendor doesn't know what your policies and procedures are. And so there was always a disconnect. So we tried to point out that, as an example in the contract, put in, do not use default passwords, because we caught them all the time. And it's like, this does not equate to good security in any world. So if it's saying those kind of squishy terms, it gets difficult to defend them.
I'm going to thank you very much. I'm going to kind of close out with something for people to review. The Consumer Fairness Protection Act of 2016 allows you to test and evaluate any of the products that you purchase in your organization and allows you to actually talk about that publicly. So there's no contract, there's no clause in any contract that states you cannot test our product and you cannot talk about it, because the Consumer Fairness Protection Act actually retroactively invalidated all of those statements in all legal contracts. So I'll move on and I'll kick it back to Sherri and Lake Missoula Group, but you would look into that. So whenever you're talking with your attorneys, you can give them something concrete to look into. And the case for that you want to look at is NSS Labs versus CrowdStrike out of the state of Delaware. All right, Sherri, throwing it back to you and your team.
Thanks, John. That's really important. Appreciate it. Okay, we have a few more stories to share with you before we wrap up, so I'll try to move fairly quickly. One is the baby bandit. Babyface Brian, the baby bandit. So we were again testing a hospital, different hospital, and in this case we had 2 testers on site at the same time. One of them was doing a standard wireless assessment, totally on the up and up, everybody knows about it, and the other one was stealthy. He was doing social engineering. Normally we would not do these both at the same time, but the client really insisted on those dates, and so it was a pretty big facility, so we figured that would be okay. So our wireless pen tester, Brian, was walking through the facility doing a very thorough job, and he got to the maternity ward. And I don't know how many of you have either had children or visited people in the maternity ward, but they've got those places on lockdown.
Yep.
And so he went there and said, hey, I'm doing a wireless assessment. I need access to the maternity ward. And they called physical security. And they said, and remember, it was IT that had hired us. So they called physical security and said, is someone doing a wireless assessment right now? And physical security said, nope. In the meantime, Brian, who couldn't get in, decided to go have some lunch, and so he went to the cafeteria, and he's sitting there eating his lunch. Zach is our social engineer, and Zach at this point has had full access to the whole facility. He's actually on the upper level of the cafeteria, and he sees Brian come in, and he sees Brian sit down, and then he sees 6 big burly guys come up and surround Brian, circle around him, and interrogate him and take him away. And then he, of course, went around the whole facility and ended up, I think, stealing a server.
Yep.
And walking out with it. So the big question here, of course, is who within the organization knows that you're conducting a test? The wireless test was completely legitimate, and Brian just assumed that their security team was in the know, and then making sure that everybody who needs to know is in the loop so that physical security would know who to call to actually verify whether or not a wireless assessment was being conducted. So, oh, clicker. I'll be our clicker again. Okay, Delaney. Delaney has not had many hiccups because she's extremely good at communicating, but I'll let her talk about what she's seen.
Yeah. So I've been fortunate not to have any major incidents while doing this type of testing, but one that does come to mind was I was performing social engineering engagement for an organization, and we were targeting 2 of their different office locations. So these were leased spaces within a larger complex made up of, various other office suites and retail spaces. And I was concluding testing, so everything went smoothly on my end as far as, getting into the areas I was targeting. And I was on my way out, just about to exit the elevator and get into the lobby area. And I was immediately confronted by 3 security guards from the building's security team. So they confronted me and actually, pulled me and escorted me into a separate room where I was detained. So, at that point, they were fairly concerned about who I was and why I was there. I think somebody probably grew suspicious during testing. But yeah, so I gave them our get out of jail letter, which is essentially a letter that states, who I am, why I'm there, that we've been authorized to conduct this type of testing. And then it also includes the point of contact details from our clients. So the security team attempted to contact our point of contact, but they actually weren't available. So they tried a few different times. They couldn't reach him. I was trying to text. I couldn't reach him either. So I was actually detained until we were finally able to get a hold of him. So, we eventually smoothed things over. I think it could have been much worse, but there was a few, key takeaways there really was, making sure the point of contact was going to be available during the times of testing we had discussed, designating a backup point of contact in the event that he wasn't available. And then the third one, which I think was one of the bigger ones, was making sure that the property management company and their security team was looped in about testing, and, that authorization was received if they needed it as a tenant of the building.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Good takeaways. So next up, again, the takeaways from this, first of all, for those of you who are not pen testers, we always carry what we call a get out of jail free letter. Keep in mind that these can be faked. Absolutely. We'll come back to that point, but the letter needs to have a clear scope. So the addresses that you're going to be testing, the times that you're okay to test, and a specific description of the activities. Is this only social engineering? Is it also, issues that have come up even today? Only social engineering. Does it also include lock picking and physical penetration testing? Who your contact is, and a good lesson that I learned from Delaney, who your backup contact is. One thing that comes up a lot is that if clients verify the get out of jail free letter, usually they will call the number that's on the letter. So what's the problem problem with this.
We put fake numbers on there.
We put fake numbers on there. And I know some pen testers, in fact, I think we've done this a couple times, where we have a fake get out of jail free letter to see if that gets us through, because anybody can create a get out of jail free letter and say, hi, I'm a security tester. So ideally, you want to train your clients to look up contact information from their own systems. Oh, Joe Schmo, I'm going to look him up in my own systems and call him, and not just go off what's in the letter, because anybody could be at the other end of the line. And of course, as testers, we need to understand who is in the loop and who is not in the loop. Oh, well, that worked. Good. Okay, so I think we're going to conclude with a couple stories from Matt. Matt is, I was going to say you're not a pen tester, but you actually are sometimes. But the bulk of the work, yeah.
Sherri, I wanted to let you know that our next speaker has dropped out, so you don't have to rush. If we go a little bit longer in answering questions, would that be okay with you and your team?
Yeah, I think Dan may have to scooch out. Just go when you need to go, okay. Dan. But we'll conclude with a couple stories from Evil Matt over here, as we like to call him. Matt does a lot of research, and he also does a lot of incident response. And these issues that we're talking about of authentication and authorization apply to other areas of cybersecurity, like breach response and ransomware response, and not just physical pen testing or other kinds of pen testing. So Matt, take it away.
Thank you. So yeah, the first instance we want to talk about is what you see in the bullet points on the slide on the screen. This was a city, a municipality that had been held for ransom through a ransomware attack against their network. And it was, I mean, as far as ransomware attacks go, it was very successful. It had locked the city out of all their services. And someone in the city had decided to release a public statement on their own, letting kind of the community know what had happened. So myself and a coworker we were on this one very quickly. So we were there the day that the ransomware attack happened. I think we found out about it at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and we were on a plane to the client's location at 2 o'clock that afternoon. We showed up and immediately went straight to the client's location because we wanted to get on this as quickly as possible. And as we pulled into the client's kind of city hall location, we noticed a news van in the parking lot and two guys slumped down behind the steering wheel with a couple of red flashlights looking over notes. And they were actually waiting for us to show up so they could get a shot of us walking in the building. Now, as far as exposure goes, this is really not what we want to see when we pull up to a client's location. We want to be able to get in, do our work, and get out with as little disruption as possible and causing as little kind of headline-worthy news as possible.
Your mom saw you on TV.
She did. I got a call from my mom the next morning saying that she saw me on TV, which was kind of how we knew they had actually got shots of us. But they had really, really poor physical security for this building, especially for it being a municipality that was kind of, a multi-tenant organization where City Hall was there, the police force was there. I mean, it was somewhere where you would want to have good kind of office segmentation and very good kind of access control to your areas, which is something else that we ran into as a problem. We were in the process of running our investigation and collecting data. And and this is a Saturday, so the IR team is the only ones who are supposed to be in the building. Well, as we're collecting data and imaging computers and taking notes on sensitive stuff that we're seeing, a member of the volunteer police force just walks right through the padlock doors or the key lock doors with a cup of coffee in his hand into the secure server area and just plops down at the table because he wants to talk to us about what's happening. Now, we have no idea who this guy is. We don't have authorization to talk to anyone from the volunteer police force. We're supposed to be very, very tight-lipped on the information. And this guy's basically sitting with his feet up on the table with all of our gear spread out in front of him. So our notes, images of computers, any other piece of information we have that's visible, he has access to at that point.
Did you put his cup of coffee right next to
his cup of coffee right down next to one of our imaging computers and just about gave me a heart attack at that point. So this got a little bit more interesting the next day because we actually were joined by members of the FBI. Because this was a city issue, they're a government issue technically at that point. The FBI had jumped in and wanted to get copies of the information that we had taken the night before. So we immediately called and woke Sherri up at that point.
You did not wake me up. I do not sleep.
Well, this was an interesting thing for us because what is the procedure for that? We have authorization from the client in writing and through our contracts to be collecting this information that is potentially sensitive to city business, contains potential employee information, things that we don't just want to hand out to anyone. And now the FBI wants copies of exactly what we've taken. So what do we do with that?
And it was clear that the FBI was used to security personnel just handing it over.
Sure.
Which is not something that our contract with the client allows. So what we did was we contacted the client, got permission from them, signed in writing, and then we were able to provide that evidence. And it was quick and easy. It wasn't hard, but that way we have that paper trail, and they have the opportunity to say, you know what, I actually don't want all that information being disclosed, and then they can discuss that themselves.
Oh, of course. And the FBI was really, really understanding about this. Apparently that's, they were a little surprised that we had first kind of put the hand up and told them no, but
Politely,
they got over it. Yeah,
politely.
very politely.
Relationships.
But, yeah, it was an interesting experience to have.
Yeah. Okay, tell us about your next one. There we
go. This is a good one too. So we were working with a police department that had suffered a pretty serious cyber incident, let's call it. And inside of the police department, it was again a shared space. Only this time there was an actual FBI presence in the office. So they had FBI agents that would rotate through and actually work out of this office. And they also had FBI hardware, so computers and network connections kind of intermingled with the other computers that were on the network. So as we're going through, we're trying to identify what we call our high value targets. So we're looking for servers that might contain sensitive information, criminal records, things like that. And the IT manager is walking through and just pointing at computers that are on the ground and saying, image that one, image that one, image that one. So I mean, we don't know any better at that point. We start imaging these computers. And we noticed that one of the computers that he pointed us to that was inside of their dispatch center had a name that was drastically different in length and format from every other computer we had seen on the network. And that kind of threw up a little bit of a red flag for us. So we got with their commanding officer and started asking about what all the hardware was that was contained within that office. And he let us know that the computer that we had just started to image, so we're pulling the hard drive contents at that point, is, let's call it a juicy FBI database relay computer. So there is a lot of information on that computer that is something that we are not authorized to take at that point.
I'm so impressed that you actually escalated this and brought it to their attention.
We had to. I don't want to go to prison.
How many times things like that go out the door?
Yeah, well, and that was the question we had, is that what if we hadn't known that? And I had walked out the door with a full copy of all the data on that computer in my bag as we're going back to the hotel. Like there's obviously some potential issues with that. But yeah, it was a great indication that or a great example of how knowing what's actually in scope within the network kind of made all the difference at that point.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. So Dan, I know you might have to run. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Okay, so bottom line, this is one of the trickier, here, I don't know if you guys want to scooch down. This is one of the trickier topics in cybersecurity today. Law enforcement and cybersecurity consultants need to mutually authenticate each other and understand what we're authorized to do, but it's not like there's some central database that says, yes, you're a legit penetration tester. And without that inside knowledge of the organization, it can actually be very hard to discriminate between someone who's legitimately there on both sides and someone who is not. And we see that come up all the time. So when we encounter each other, law enforcement and cybersecurity personnel, we should all expect that there's going to be this initial questioning period where it is totally appropriate to ask the other person for their badge or their business card or their get out of jail free letter, and just take that first level of attempt at verification. That doesn't mean that that's 100% going to verify or authenticate the other person, but it's the first step. And then you can conduct further verification if you need to by potentially calling known contacts. Call the police department, call the organization's contacts, maybe call people within the company if they're a consultant that you may know. And this is where having those pre-existing relationships, as I'm sure those of you who are experienced testers know, having those pre-existing relationships makes a huge difference. So organizations and associations like InfraGard, like the HTCAA, that bring law enforcement and cybersecurity professionals together, serve this really important purpose in the community. It allows us to get to know each other, to biometrically authenticate each other in some cases, and just really gives us those connections we need to help smooth things out when there are issues that come up. So with that, I think we're at the point where we're wrapping up. Yep. So just some takeaways from today. And again, John, thank you so much for having us. For pen testers and clients, there are things that all of us can do to help make sure that pen tests go more safely and smoothly. Pen testers need to authenticate our targets. Know your scope. And this is true on both sides. So clients, we really need your help in supporting that target authentication, not getting upset when we try to verify our targets. And if you hire pen testers, you can also help by documenting your IP addresses, making sure they're kept up to date. It's just sort of good hygiene in general anyway. Everybody needs to carefully review the scope, let people know in advance if there's any questions or concerns. Pen testers need to carefully communicate information. So as someone mentioned before, don't just expect your client to read through 30 pages of legalese. Take that time, like Delaney does, to sit down, to confirm in writing, to have phone calls, to make sure you're all on the same page. We need to check the authorization of our contacts. So a big question that comes up is, okay, this person way high up in an organization signed the contract. Who is actually authorized to tell you, who's actually authorized to give you the scope or to tell you to halt work? That's especially important when there's internal political issues, which absolutely come up. And we need to build relationships with law enforcement to smooth things out. And then on the client side, again, we talked about supporting authentication of targets, but we need to clearly designate those authorized staff, check and understand the scope. Ideally, establish contracts with vendors and employees and your landlords. Make sure everybody in your community is on the same page and knows that at some point testing will be conducted. And you need to train internal staff so that they know to call IT and not physical security to check if there's a wireless test getting done, or just to make sure that they're responding appropriately. So with that, Matt, Delaney, and I will stick around a few minutes if there's any questions. And John, if you wouldn't mind repeating any questions, that would be super helpful.
Happy to. So let's start with the room. Jason's queuing up some questions for the people that are online right now. Are there any questions for Sherri and her team in the room? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the importance of independently verifying like a phone number you see on a get out of jail free card. Do firms that do this on a regular basis publish special numbers that people can call to verify, like on a website? Let's say Black Hills Information Security website. Do you provide specific like a specific phone number that someone could call or look up?
So so Sherri, the question was, for firms that do this quite a bit, is it common practice for firms to actually publish a phone number that somebody can call and do this type of verification? I'll let Sherri and her team go first, and then I'll answer from ours. So go ahead, Sherri.
I mean, we have our clients have quite a few internal numbers for us, depending on what we're doing. And our law enforcement contacts typically have numbers for us as well. We have our main line, and then we have, because we do incident response, there's a number to press for emergencies. I wouldn't say that we have a number specifically out there to verify the authenticity of a tester, although that's an interesting idea. I would maybe worry about getting spam calls, but I think that's an interesting point. John, what do you think about that?
We actually have a calling service. So if you call in, it will basically hit a mailing, or not a mailing list, a little phone list of multiple different people. More importantly than that number on our website is we actually have specific phone numbers all the way up to myself on every single contract. And
right.
I'm pretty sure that Sherri has the exact same thing, because if something goes wrong, we're the ones that want to get the phone call at 2 a.m. that our people have been arrested, or which is a worst case scenario. We want to be able to deal with that as quickly and as efficiently as we possibly can. So,
thank you.
You bet. All right, any other questions from the room? Yes.
Given today, I wondered if other organizations have run into this jurisdiction issue, like state and county. This is kind of new that everyone's figuring out.
Okay, so Sherri and the team for Lake Missoula Group, the question was, have we ever encountered a situation where jurisdiction is somewhat in question? Is it a state issue or a county issue? I have kind of a weird answer, but I'll let Sherri and Lake Missoula Group go first.
Yeah, and by the way, our company name is LMG Security these days. It's changed since you and I started.
I'm old school, sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries, old school. Let's see, have we had any jurisdictional issues?
When it comes to, yeah, we have. Honestly, incident response runs into that somewhat frequently.
How can you sanitize this?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how I can say this without revealing too much information about it. We'll just go in general terms. Working with an organization that is a county-run organization is one of the more recent instances that we have. In this particular case, we were looking at access to a cloud-based data service that they actually shared with the state at that point. The issue was the way that it was configured. The state and the county had no kind of differentiation between whose data was whose inside of the network.
Yeah, no segmentation.
And so we were looking at doing e-discovery work on that. And in doing e-discovery work for the county, we would have inadvertently been running e-discovery searches against the entire state's database at that point, which we were not authorized to do through scope or authorization from our legal contacts. So yeah, we do run into jurisdictional problems pretty frequently, or somewhat frequently, when we're working in big data sets like that.
So how do you resolve that?
The question was, as a follow-up, how do you resolve that?
So the way that we're kind of looking at doing that is essentially providing kind of our methodology to the state at that point, and then allowing the state to pull that data and provide it back down to us, so that the person who's actually accessing the data and sanitizing it is kind of the authorized party at that point. If they inadvertently end up providing something to us that we shouldn't have, that kind of falls back onto them at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So we're working with local IT to provide guidance and help them understand how to test something or take the next step if it's unclear whether or not we're authorized to do that.
Yeah.
All right, so my story on this from a jurisdiction perspective, I have two quick ones. The first one is international. We had a file that we received from the Mounties up in Canada. They didn't understand what this file was. They wanted us to see what this file was. They sent it to me. And it was actually an encrypted file. It was actually a compressed encrypted file. We broke the password, and as soon as we got into the file, it had illegal pornography on it. So immediately when you're talking about jurisdictional issues, you have something that's in Canada, but now I have illegal files that are even illegal to possess or view on my computer system. So in that particular situation, I immediately picked up the phone, called the local FBI, told them exactly what I had, how I'd get access to it. And doing that just clean communication from the start makes things a lot better. It also helps to know your law enforcement agency in the various places where you work. The other one, this actually is jurisdiction on a military base. I came up through the NRO, NSA, FBI, and CIA doing a bunch of intelligence stuff years ago. And I was hired to break into a highly classified facility on a military base, physically break into it. I was young, I was stupid, and I didn't realize at that time that that was a very, very bad idea. So I had this theory that if I could get arrested past a certain point, I would not be taken into general custody on the base, but I would be taken into a highly classified holding area. And my hope was I'd gain access to a network jack in doing that. By the way, anytime you do anything with classified and you get a certain clearance, they'll give you duress words. They're words like usually 3 or 4 words that are never used together. So if you ever pick up the phone, call a number, you use those 3 words in any conjunction with each other at all, it automatically notifies that you're in duress. So I had these words. I had my get out of jail free card in my back pocket. I was able to get onto the military base. I was able to get to the highly classified part of the military base. And that's where everything went very wrong. I had a large number of very, very angry 19 and 20-year-olds with fully automatic weapons hunt me down. I laid down on the ground, put my hands behind my back, crossed my ankles, put them up, and they were not gentle. I actually have a scar from here to here for Latarjet reconstructive surgery for my shoulder from what happened in that particular event. And then once they ripped my shoulder out, I started screaming my duress words, which just sounded like gibberish, right? Because I'm crying. And I'm like, oh, pineapple, chicken, whatever the words were. I can't even remember what they were. But I got thrown into a room, and sure enough, there was an Ethernet jack, so I was successful. Now, jurisdiction. The jurisdiction on that was who had the ability to authorize me to do that. Because on military bases, there'll be many different branches of the armed forces all working together. It turned into this huge nightmare, very similar kind of to what's going on here. Who's responsible for authorizing what? How did people get confirmation about what they were supposed to do, their targets they were allowed to do? And then I had the base commander set me down and very clearly state, never do this again. You could have been shot. I'm like, I understand. So some are a little bit worse than others. Jason, do we have any questions for Sherri and LMG Security online?
We have two. The first one is, do you have any guidance if an employee brings personal devices and connects to the network, either unauthorized or part of a BO, bring your own device policy, and the test you're doing hits that device?
Ooh, so that's a really good question. And again, this is one where if you are an organization that hires penetration testers, you want to, and you have employee devices on your network, or you allow them, you want to broach this in advance. So in your little message to users when they sign in, or maybe in advance when they sign an acceptable use policy, you probably want to let them know that a penetration test will be conducted. Or if they're going to get thrown on a separate network, you could exclude that from penetration testing. We certainly see that happen, like a guest wireless is a good example of that. If they're breaking your policy and putting personal devices on the network in violation of that, I think you have bigger issues, and there's not much that you can do. They may end up getting hit in a penetration test, but they're not supposed to be there in the first place. So I am not a lawyer, but we have a lawyer in the room if he has anything further to add.
Add to that? Warn your employees.
Warn. So Ben just said, warn your employees before it happens.
Yeah, warn your employees. Give them a heads up, ideally in writing. I like to get everything in writing.
Next question. And then the second question is more of a regarding establishing relationships with local law enforcement. Thoughts on contacting law enforcement groups in the area prior to establish ahead of groups in the target area to establish ahead of time that you're a legitimate pen testing firm to help prevent potential high tension first encounters?
Absolutely. There's always community organizations like I would imagine SecDSM is in the room here. So look at your public events or events that are targeted at the security community, and hopefully law enforcement is coming to some of those as well. Brandon and Tom and Antoinette, I think I saw you three are in the room. If you could raise your hand so that people know you're there. You can always talk to them to get involved. And for the security, the folks that organize those, I think that inviting law enforcement to events, or maybe just having a law enforcement mixer to attract folks from law enforcement and help build those relationships, that can be really helpful. There's also organizations that are specifically designed for that purpose. So InfraGuard is that partnership between the FBI and the public. The HCCA, the High Tech Crime Investigation Association, brings together law enforcement and investigative personnel, private investigators, and also security personnel as well. So you have quite a few effective community organizations that you could join. Great question.
I would also, I think that what Sherri just talked about is something that's going to take a long time. If we look at what this event is, it's designed to be that type of outreach, right? I sincerely hope that members of law enforcement are actually watching this, or at least will watch the archived version of it. But this is not something that's going to happen overnight. Also, as a penetration tester, you have state law enforcement, you have county law enforcement. Sometimes within specific organizations, they have their own separate law enforcement that may be. You may even have federal law enforcement. And if you talk to somebody, and especially whenever you're talking about law enforcement in some very dense population areas, that may not be communicated effectively to absolutely everyone. Also, I want you to think about how a phone conversation like that goes. You call up the 1-800 number for local law enforcement. You say, hi, my name is John Strand. I need to talk to somebody in the sheriff's office. Okay, well, they put you through. You maybe get a deputy or a sheriff. You say, hi, I'm with Black Hills Information Security, and we're going to be breaking into buildings in your local area in the next week. When are you doing this exactly? Sorry, I can't tell you that. Which buildings? Okay, I can maybe tell you the buildings. But you also need to understand that from the perspective of the person you're talking to, you sound insane. And in their day-to-day operations, that's probably a pretty safe bet that you're just absolutely out of your mind, number one. You can even give them phone numbers. Here, call these people. They say it's okay. If I was a law enforcement agent, I don't think I would trust anything that you would give me. Absolutely not. And then, like I said, getting that kind of disseminated to everybody in the police force, that probably doesn't happen as quickly and easily as you would think. So I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying expect pushback, expect that there's going to be issues, and expect that you're going to have to do a lot of explaining before you do that as well. Anything else to add, LMG Security?
Yeah, this is such an important conversation. I think we've really only scratched the surface of this, but I haven't seen a discussion like this really happen, especially one that's so widely distributed in a very long time. So I think we're at a point where all of us need to work together to help make cybersecurity testing safer, whether you're a professional pen tester or whether you hire professional pen testers or you're law enforcement or just part of the general community. So let's keep this conversation going. I'm so glad, John, that you guys are putting the recordings out there. If you have community groups like your local security organization, if you have law enforcement folks you know or other people, please share these recordings, continue these conversations within your local community, because that's how we're going to make progress and not end up with things like the man catcher. We need real seatbelts. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, LMG security team and Sherri. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.